Hello, everyone. Tonight we're taking you deep into the heart of the Philippines, into a place where darkness has a name, and it feeds on fear. This isn't just a story. It's a true account from a survivor, a man who lived through 8 nights of terror against something the locals call the Aswang. So before we begin, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this video with anyone brave enough to watch till the end. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's step into the night. A remote Filipino village. I never believed the stories my grandmother told me about the Aswang. She spoke in hushed tones, warning me of a creature that walks among humans during the day, blending perfectly into society. Sometimes it is an old woman selling vegetables at the market. Sometimes a man living alone at the edge of the forest. But when night falls, it sheds its human disguise. It hunts. I was 19, brimming with confidence, when I traveled from Manila to my mother's ancestral village in Capiz. The journey itself was long and eerie. Paved roads vanished into muddy tracks lined by towering coconut palms. The jungle encroached on the tiny hamlets, and the air carried a damp, musty smell that seemed to seep into my lungs. The village was quaint but secretive. Less than 100 families lived there, yet everyone knew everyone else's business. Every home was adorned with charms, crosses carved into doors, salt scattered on thresholds, and small bundles of herbs hung in windows. They said it was to keep evil at bay. I laughed at their superstition the first night, but laughter died on the third night. It began with faint flapping sounds, almost imperceptible at first. Then came scratching, slow, deliberate. Something moved across the roof and along the bamboo walls of my small room. I peered through the window but could see only shadows and moonlight bouncing off the leaves. Then I saw 2 glowing eyes, yellowish, almost reptilian. They vanished instantly, but I knew they had been there. My dog, who had slept all day in the corner, began growling, then whining, and finally went silent. That silence was worse than any sound. It made the forest feel alive, watching, waiting. By morning, the villagers whispered about a carabao found in the rice field, its blood completely drained. The Aswang, they said. I forced myself to believe it was a wild animal, something explainable, but my gut screamed otherwise. The next night, the flapping returned. I could feel the rhythm in my chest, rising and falling like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I clutched my grandmother's rosary and whispered prayers under my breath. The air in my room grew cold, carrying the stench of decay. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. And then I heard it. A voice, soft and almost human, whispering my name. It sounded like my mother, but she was miles away. Hours passed like minutes. I dared not move. My eyes were fixed on the window. Claws scraped the roof. The flapping grew louder, then stopped directly above me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Suddenly, an old man outside shouted, "Aswang! Aswang!" Chaos erupted. Torches flared. Dogs barked. Villagers ran through the dirt streets wielding spears, bamboo sticks, anything to fight it off. The creature shrieked, a sound so piercing it made me cover my ears. When dawn finally broke, the roof was empty. Only blood dripped from one bamboo pole. The men said I was lucky. They told me the creature had almost entered my room. They sprinkled salt along the floor, muttered prayers over ashes of burned coconut husks, and stood guard until sunrise. Days passed slowly. I noticed the villagers becoming quieter at night, retreating indoors well before sunset. Children stayed close to their parents, never playing near the forest edge. Everyone had a story, encounters with the Aswang that they swore were true. I listened to every story, each one making the hair on my neck stand up. One old woman spoke of a young girl who vanished while fetching water. The girl's body was never found, but the villagers claimed they found her sandals empty and soaked in blood, near the edge of the forest. Another man described seeing a woman transform mid-flight over the rice fields, her lower body separated from her torso, wings stretching wide as she screamed at the wind. I shivered. That was not a story. That was the manananggal. But in this village, they all feared the Aswang equally. I began keeping vigil every night. I would sit silently, listening to the sounds of the jungle, my rosary clenched tightly in my hand. Sometimes I would hear flapping in the distance, a whisper of a laugh, a scratching against bamboo poles. I learned that the Aswang doesn't just hunt for food, it hunts for fear, feeding off the terror it creates. One night, it came closer than ever. I was certain it would enter my room. I could hear the nails scraping the door frame, the soft padding across the floor. My hands were trembling. My prayers ran together. And then I remembered the old grandmother's advice. Scatter salt around your room, hang herbs at the window, never look directly at its eyes. I did everything I could think of. I whispered every prayer I knew, scattered salt across the floor, burned coconut husks until the smoke filled the room. And then, silence. I don't know if it fled because of the precautions or if it was simply toying with me. But I survived the night. When I finally left the village weeks later, I was changed. I had seen things no one in the city could imagine. I still remember the tracks in the mud, leading into the jungle and disappearing into the shadows. I remember the silver bracelet lying among the leaves, proof that some people don't return once the Aswang chooses them. Even now, years later, in Manila, when the wind howls, I sometimes hear a faint flap. Flap of wings. My body tenses instinctively, and I remember my grandmother's words. The second night was worse than the first. By now I knew the Aswang had marked me. I could feel it watching from the shadows of the village. I stayed awake until the moon rose high, my senses stretched to their limit. Around 11 p.m. I heard the faint flapping again. This time it was closer, like something circling the roof, testing the walls, listening. My dog whimpered in its corner. The villagers had warned me. Never leave your room at night, never speak loudly, never make a sound that could attract it. I sat silently, eyes fixed on the window. And then I saw them, two glowing eyes moving slowly through the banana grove. They paused, blinked, and I realized they weren't human. Not entirely. Their shape shifted, elongated, almost liquid as they moved from tree to tree. I remembered the old man's words. Do not look directly at its eyes. Fear will feed it. I forced myself to look away, my gaze fixed on the floor. But the flapping grew louder, more deliberate now above my roof. I could feel the vibrations in my chest. The creature was patient. It knew I was awake. Around midnight, I heard the softest whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then I realized it was calling my name, my full name, in a voice eerily similar to my mother's. My stomach churned. I had no one to turn to. Even if I screamed, no one would hear me above the jungle's sounds. I remembered the talismans. Salt on the floor, herbs by the windows. I sprinkled more salt, muttering prayers, my hands trembling. I lit a small fire of coconut husks, letting the smoke fill the room. The smell was unbearable, but it masked the scent of human blood, or perhaps it disguised my fear. The flapping stopped abruptly. I dared not breathe. The silence was worse than the noise. Hours passed. My body ached from holding a position, my eyes dry from staring into the shadows. By dawn, the creature was gone. The only sign it had been there were deep scratches on the roof and a faint smear of blood on the bamboo wall. I was lucky, or at least the villagers said so. Night 3. The hunt expands. The third night, the fear became a constant companion. I started to hear whispers beyond my room, from other houses in the village. Some people claimed to have seen shadows move independently of their owners. Others swore they heard footsteps on the roofs, dragging across tiles in a rhythm that mimicked human walking. But it was too heavy, too deliberate. I realized then that the Aswang was not just hunting for food, it was hunting fear itself. Each shadow I imagined, every creak of the bamboo, fed it. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. My nerves were raw, every sound amplified. That night I ventured a glance outside. The village seemed normal, quiet, but then I saw a figure near the rice fields moving oddly. It bent its torso inhumanly, limbs stretching, its shadow towering over the crops. Its eyes caught the moonlight, yellow, molten, alive. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug, knocking over a lamp. The clatter echoed across the village. A shriek answered not far from my house. Someone, maybe the Aswang, maybe another villager screaming in fear, had reacted. I ran to my room and bolted the door, praying silently, tears streaming down my face. Night 4. The narrow escape. By the fourth night, I had learned the creature's habits. It never moved during the full moon. It preferred nights when the jungle was dark, shadows long. I decided to stay awake, keeping a constant vigil, using the smallest sliver of moonlight to see the perimeter. At 2 a.m., the flapping began again. This time it was deliberate, strategic. It circled the house, pausing as if assessing the defenses. Salt, smoke, prayers. Then I heard scratching at the bamboo doorframe. Slow, precise, as if it were testing the barrier. I remembered the grandmother's final advice. If it finds a way inside, do not fight it directly. Escape, hide, survive. Its hunger is patient, but you can outlast it. I waited until it moved away, then quietly slipped out through a hidden back exit, crawling into the dense forest. The jungle smelled of wet earth and decay. Every rustle was terrifying. I could hear the faint flapping in the distance. It was following, but not yet ready to strike. Hours passed. I stumbled through the undergrowth, exhausted, barely breathing. Then I reached a small creek. The water's movement and noise masked my scent. I stayed in the mud until the sun rose and the Aswang vanished into the darkness of the forest. Aftermath, I returned to the village weeks later, under heavy sunlight, and packed my things. I was changed. My hands shook. My mind replayed every flapping sound, every whisper, every glowing eye. I learned that the village would never be entirely safe. The Aswang moves on, yes, but it leaves traces, victims, and fear behind. Even today in the city, I sometimes hear faint flaps in the wind. And I know the Aswang is still out there, waiting for the next fool who stops believing. By the fifth night, I had become painfully aware that I was no longer a mere visitor. I was a target. I could feel the eyes of the Aswang everywhere, even when I closed mine. The villagers no longer laughed at my fear. Instead, they offered quiet advice in whispers. Do not leave your house, an old woman warned me. Do not go near the creek. Never touch a shadow that does not belong to you. I tried to follow their instructions, but that night a child vanished, one I had been teaching a few simple English words. His mother screamed for hours, searching along the bamboo groves, only to find his sandals soaked in mud. Empty. No one spoke of the boy afterward except in fearful whispers. From my room I could hear soft, distant flapping. The Aswang was hunting again. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe, clutching my grandmother's rosary and muttering every prayer I knew. I watched the shadows stretch unnaturally across the walls, twisting, moving as if alive. Night 6. The Encounter. By now, I had a strategy. I would wait until midnight, then watch the perimeter, ready to escape if necessary. Around 1:45 a.m., I saw a dark figure glide silently across the rooftops of the neighboring houses. Its glowing eyes pierced the night. I froze. Then it turned its gaze toward me. My heart nearly stopped. I remembered what the old man had said. Never stare directly at its eyes. Fear will feed it. Look away and survive. I did not dare. Instead, I whispered prayers and sprinkled more salt across the floor, setting fire to dried coconut husks. The smoke filled my room, choking, bitter, but it hid my presence. The creature hovered above the roof for what felt like hours. Every second stretched like eternity. Then, with a terrifying shriek, it finally left. I collapsed on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, tears of fear and relief mixing on my face. Night 7. The narrowest escape. The 7th night was my final test. I had prepared an escape route through the jungle behind the village, a path I had memorized during daylight. I waited for the creature to come, listening to the eerie sounds of the forest. At 2 a.m., the familiar flap began. It circled, testing, waiting. I waited, heart hammering. I could feel its presence, patient and cruel. Then it scratched at the bamboo doorframe, slow, deliberate, hungry. I stayed calm, remembering my grandmother's words. If it finds a way inside, do not fight it, survive. I grabbed a small bundle of herbs, some salt, and quietly slipped out the back, into the jungle. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant flaps, whispering winds. Every step could reveal me, every snap of a twig might be my last. I crawled through mud and vines, hiding beneath thick foliage. The creature followed, circling, waiting. I reached the creek just as the first sunlight touched the canopy. The rushing water masked my scent. Exhausted, soaked, trembling, I realized I had survived. Aftermath and reflection. Weeks later, I returned to Manila, forever changed. My hands still tremble when I hear flapping at night. I have nightmares of glowing eyes and whispering voices. I learned that the Aswang does not merely hunt. It thrives on fear, and it moves silently from village to village, leaving horror in its wake. Even now, when the wind howls and the moon hides behind clouds, I imagine it is there, watching, waiting for the next fool who stops believing. I survived, but the memory will never leave me. And I will never forget the wisdom of my grandmother. By the 8th night, I had stopped counting. Each night blurred into the next, filled with flapping, scratching, and whispers. Sleep was a memory. Fear was constant. I had learned to detect the Aswang's presence even before I saw it. The subtle shift of shadows, the faintest flapping in the wind, the smell of rotting flesh carried on the jungle air. That night I prepared differently. I gathered everything: salt, dried herbs, coconut husks, a small knife, and my grandmother's rosary. I sprinkled salt around my room, hung bundles of herbs at the windows, and lit fires of coconut husks in every corner. Smoke filled the room, choking but protective. At midnight, the flapping began, closer than ever, deliberate, confident. It circled my house, testing, assessing, waiting for weakness. My dog whimpered but stayed silent, knowing instinctively that any noise could betray me. Then came the scratching at the bamboo doorframe. Slow, deliberate. My heart thudded so violently I thought it would burst. I whispered prayers under my breath, trying to steady my trembling hands. I remembered my grandmother's warning. If it finds a way inside, do not fight it. Run, hide, survive. Patience will save you. I waited. Hours passed. The scratching stopped, then moved across the roof, circling, observing. My strategy was simple: survive until dawn. I knew the Aswang hunted best under darkness. It was patient but relied on fear and night. At 2:30 a.m. I made my move. I opened a small back exit and crawled into the jungle. The forest was alive with sounds: rustling leaves, distant flapping, whispering winds. Every step could reveal me. I moved slowly, hiding beneath thick foliage, relying on instinct, listening to the creatures' circling wings above. Hours passed. Dawn approached. My muscles ached. My lungs burned. Every shadow seemed to follow me. Then the first sunlight hit the jungle canopy. The Aswang disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the faint memory of wings and glowing eyes. I reached the creek, letting the rushing water mask my scent. I stayed there until the sun fully rose. Exhausted, soaked, shaking, I realized I had survived. The village and the others weeks later, I returned to the village during daylight. I spoke to villagers who had seen the creature but lived to tell the tale. Each had their story. Shadows moving independently, flapping sounds above their homes, animals found drained of blood. The Aswang was not defeated, it was patient, moving silently from house to house, village to village. They told me that those who survived were marked forever. Even now, years later, I feel its presence. The sound of flapping in the wind makes my blood run cold. Shadows twist in ways that make me jump. Every darkened room reminds me that the Aswang is patient, silent, always waiting. Reflection and the unending fear. I survived, but the memory never left me. Even in Manila, in the bright city streets, I sometimes hear it. Soft flapping above rooftops, a whisper in the wind. A shadow that stretches unnaturally. I cannot sleep fully. I cannot ignore the faint smell of decay in humid air. I live knowing that the Aswang never dies. It waits for the next village, the next careless traveler, the next fool who stops believing. And I remember my grandmother's final words. Fear will follow you. The Aswang tests patience, courage, and every ounce of your will to survive. But if you respect it, pray, and stay alive, you may escape its hunger. I escaped. Others were not so lucky. And the stories continue. Every village whispers them, every child fears the dark, every night is a test.